So next in our series of interviews with those involved in the resolution of homicide cases and support for homicide victims, we have with us today Dr. Alana Abramson here to talk about restorative justice. Dr. Abramson is a full-time criminology instructor at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, coordinator for the Alternatives to Violence Project, board member for the BC Bereavement Helpline and the Restorative Justice Association BC, and a trainer with Achieve Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute. So thank you very much for being here today, Alana. We really appreciate your time, and I look forward to talking to you about just exactly what is restorative justice and helping people understand its role with a homicide case and with homicide survivors. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump right in and ask you, what is restorative justice?
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm pleased to talk about restorative justice and some of the benefits that I've seen what it means for so many survivors of homicide. So restorative justice is a way of looking at harm and crime that seeks to address the needs of everyone. Restorative justice has ancient roots in many Indigenous ways of knowing and practices from all over the world. It also has roots in various faith traditions, as well as more contemporary practices and schools of thought like victims' rights, community justice, and anybody that's sort of interested in addressing some of the shortcomings of our current system, which is largely based on punishment. So restorative justice is really at its core about addressing needs that arise from harm. And it really puts victims and survivors at the center of that approach and tries to find ways to promote meaningful accountability with people who have done harm to the end of, to start to move towards, I should say, reparation and healing. And so, although restorative justice can be used instead of the contemporary legal system, in cases of homicide, restorative justice would come alongside the current system to try to address needs of victims and survivors that may not have been addressed through the legal process.
And a couple of questions on that. Then you mentioned reparation and healing. Is that a two-sided, or is this more for the survivors of the homicide, family members, or yeah, well, does it have to be a close family member who could seek restorative justice? And is it the reparation and healing of them, or does it involve the accused in their reparation and healing, would you say?
Yeah, it really is. Restorative justice is often called a three-legged stool because it seeks to balance the needs of three parties: the victim survivor, the offender, the person who's caused the harm, and the community. And the community might be the people around the victim and the offender, neighbors, other folks in the community that are affected when crime happens. And so in restorative justice, we start from a place of addressing victim needs, but the approach is also about attending to the needs of offenders and the needs of communities as well. And so what that can look like varies, but generally it takes quite a bit of exploration to understand what those needs are, and then what kind of process needs to be put in place to address those needs to the extent possible. One of the things I wanted to share is restorative justice isn't meant to replace therapeutic interventions for anyone. So we know that many survivors of homicide might benefit from services like that of BC Bereavement, support groups, grief and loss support, peer support, as well as other therapeutic interventions like counseling, trauma recovery, and so on. So restorative justice doesn't replace those for the victim or the offender's rehabilitation, but rather is another process that really seeks to personalize the justice process and ensure that everyone has a voice in that.
And who, quote unquote, qualifies to request or pursue restorative justice?
Well, in cases of homicide, it is victim initiated. So a victim survivor could contact Victim Services through the Correctional Service of Canada and make a request to learn more about restorative justice. So this is a really important safety measure because we don't want survivors to risk being re-traumatized by having an outreach, say directly from an offender, for example, to do this. So it is very, very carefully done in British Columbia through a highly regarded organization called Community Justice Initiatives, who have been doing this for over 30 years. So the victim survivor can initiate the process, and they would sit down and meet with one of the facilitators from the Restorative Justice Program, where the facilitator would invite them to share about their needs, what's happened, how have they been impacted, and what is it that they're hoping for from the process. At that time, there's no commitment to do anything more. It can purely be an exploration. And in fact, everything in restorative justice is at the victim's own pace. And so again, it's very, very important that this is done carefully and voluntarily every step of the way. So victim survivors can choose to step back from the process at any time. They might wish to take a break. They might wish further information before they take another step towards any sort of restorative encounter with the other party. And so it is a very, very careful process that sometimes can take months or even years to ultimately come to what we might call a victim offender dialogue. Many, many victims and survivors are interested in sitting down with the person who caused the harm and to ask questions about what happened, to get answers that they can only really get from the person who caused the harm. And so sometimes that process is face to face. Other times it can be facilitated through delivering video messages, letters, communication through the facilitators without coming together face to face. It really is up to the survivor how they want to proceed.
Yeah, and I mean, just thinking about the idea of perhaps sitting down face to face with a perpetrator of a murder is really powerful. But indeed, people have done that. And for those I've spoken with who have also, like you said, reached out in support with a homicide grief group or one-to-one counseling, this is another option that you could layer on top of a healing process, depending on what someone is interested in. And you mentioned, I like the phrase, it helps meet the needs that may not have been met by the criminal justice system. Can you kind of expand on that?
Mhm. Yeah, and while every victim survivor is affected differently by harm, research tells us that there are some common needs that emerge, particularly in serious cases like loss of life. And so many survivors are looking for information, what happened and why. They want often details of what happened to fill in the blanks. I remember one survivor told me that she participated in restorative justice because no matter what she was going to hear from the offender, it couldn't have been worse than the nightmares that she has about what might have been. And so many survivors are looking for information. Of course, survivors are hoping for safety, not only for themselves, but for others. And so while they may feel fairly safe while the person is incarcerated, what they know and what we know is that 99% of everyone in prison is one day going to get out. And so oftentimes people who have been affected by homicide want to know what the offender has been up to. They want to know, have they taken responsibility? Are they working on themselves? Or are they looking like they may reoffend if they're released? So while survivors can get some of this information through other channels, oftentimes people do want to sit down face to face and look the person in the eye and really ask those tough questions about accountability and responsibility and the offender's own rehabilitation. The other common need that survivors have is emotional and practical support. And unfortunately, so many people who go through the legal system hoping to have their needs met, whether it's information or feelings of safety, reassurance, or emotional support, they often find the system is lacking. And in fact, many victim survivors can feel re-victimized by encountering the criminal justice system. Not only does it take a long time, it's a public process, it's a painful process. And there, despite thinking that, many victims think that the prosecutor is their lawyer. In fact, the prosecutor is acting on behalf of the state or the crown.
Right.
That is not their lawyer. And really, aside from a victim impact statement, they lack voice in the process, not only about how the process unfolds, but the timing of it and all of that. And many survivors have their lives absolutely turned upside down by a criminal trial. And so, in addition to the harm that can come from experience with the legal system, despite people working in the system that are incredibly well-meaning, the system really wasn't designed with victims and survivors in mind. It really wasn't. And so often victim survivors find they're not getting those needs met, the needs to, as I mentioned, answers to their questions, an understanding of what happened, a full picture, some sort of voice, some sense of safety, and some role. Those things just aren't available to them in a way that they are with a restorative justice process.
Right, right. And I took note of what you said, that learning the details from the actual perpetrator couldn't be worse than the nightmares of what they thought might have happened. And I know through talking and working with homicide survivors and anybody from a traumatic loss, it's that rumination that is really characteristic of a traumatic loss. So that's interesting. I just learned something from you right there that kind of put a light bulb on. So thank you for that. Because I imagine that maybe people watching this right now couldn't imagine doing this, which is fine, right? It's not for everybody. But yeah, really interesting.
Can I just add, it's not for every survivor, and that's often because the person on the other side of this is not in a place to participate well in restorative justice. And so you were asking what a survivor might expect from this process. And I mentioned that it's voluntary for them, that it's at their own pace, that it can take a long time, that they can take their time, and that it's meant to uphold safety. In order to do restorative justice well, on the other side, the facilitators will be working with the perpetrator as well, and assessing their needs and learning about what their hopes are in participation in the process, and also ensuring that they are coming to this for the right reasons and that it's voluntary. And so just as it's not for every victim survivor, it's not for every offender. And to be sure, there are many survivors that would like this, but the person who is incarcerated for the homicide is not in a position, maybe yet or maybe ever, to come and do this in a way that is safe and respectful to the victim. So it isn't for everyone. It's not for every case. However, there are certain matters that at the start, or sort of, following the criminal trial and the sentencing, it doesn't look like there would ever be room for restorative justice. I've heard of victims many, many years later, still with unanswered questions, approaching the restorative justice program. And now, the offender who has done their own work, engaged in some of their own rehabilitation and healing, they're in a place where they can actually do this. And so everybody's timeline is different. And it is my belief that restorative justice should be offered for victims and survivors, no matter when they want it. It may be right after the incident or 50 years later. The needs still may be there. And so I think that victims have the right to that if they so choose.
And is that the case then, that anybody in BC could contact the community justice initiatives?
They can. It's harder if the person is no longer incarcerated. It can be hard to track that person down.
Yeah.
Of course, if they're on parole, that is still an option. it's just a little easier to locate the perpetrator if the person's still incarcerated. But theoretically, yes, if long after the person's released, a survivor could approach the organization to see if there was anything that could be done.
Yeah. You mentioned, so the community justice initiatives, the facilitator is the one that will communicate with the victim survivor and then navigate to the perpetrator and do that very careful kind of management of a potential meeting, whether you said through person or video or letters.
That's right.
Right. Wow. That's quite a job for that person.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's amazing. So yeah, you've mentioned it doesn't have to be a face-to-face encounter. We've mentioned exchange of letters or video, and it's on the victim's own timeline. You mentioned a phrase, voice and choice. I like that. So that's the victim's voice and the victim's choice that you were mentioning.
Definitely, from how fast or slow the process goes to decisions that seem small but really are big. Every opportunity that's possible when thinking about the logistics of trying to have some sort of meeting in a prison, for example, if the person's still incarcerated. But at all steps along the way, the victim is consulted and given choice. So for example, a survivor, if it does look like there's going to be a face-to-face, the survivor might be asked, all right, do you want to go into the room first and be seated when the offender comes in? Or would you like to have the offender sitting there and you go in? Who should speak first? What kinds of questions or topics are off limits? There's all sorts of options in the process, and the victims are actively involved with the facilitators in designing what that meeting will look like. And when we look at trauma recovery, this is really aligned with a trauma-informed approach, right? That when crime happens, we feel disempowered, we feel helpless. And so a justice process that seeks to empower wherever it can often can aid in traumatic healing for survivors.
Mm-hmm. And with that meeting, you're kind of picturing, whether you want to sit down first or the perpetrator sit down first. Is there somebody that can join you as well? Could the facilitator join you if you didn't want to be alone?
Oh, the facilitators are there the whole time. Sorry, I should have been more clear about that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the facilitators are present. Usually there's two in the room, and the victim survivor and the perpetrator. Sometimes it makes sense for the survivor to have a support person with them, so they could bring somebody there. And sometimes it's important that they have, say, the parole officer of the offender there. So I've heard survivors say, well, I don't want to just take their word for it. I want to hear from the parole officer how they think the offender's progress is. So again, lots of options there in terms of who's in the room and how those meetings unfold.
Great. So you mentioned that there's also a potential to do restorative justice if the offender hasn't been located. So there has been no conviction of a murder, or perhaps the offender has died or isn't available for restorative justice for any matter of reason. So how would they go about that?
Yeah, this depends on the creativity of the facilitators. But they are creative and very very skilled and experienced in trying to find a meaningful way forward when the offender isn't available or has passed away, or for whatever reason can't participate, or like you say, if the perpetrator has never been found. There's some creative things that are happening to some extent in British Columbia, but in lots of places around the world, where survivors will go into a prison and sit with a few prisoners who have committed a similar crime. So if we're talking about homicide, there have been homicide survivors that will go and sit in a circle with several previously screened offenders that have committed murder, not their loved one, but another murder. And people have an opportunity to sit together as human beings and to talk. And it's been transformative for victims and survivors to humanize the murderer, to be able to understand a little bit about where this behavior might have come from. It allows them to ask questions that they might have had on their minds. And of course, those perpetrators can't speak directly to their case, but survivors find it incredibly meaningful to be able to just see people in a different light than a courtroom, and to also have just a free-flowing conversation where they can ask them questions. On the other side, and I know this is focused on survivors today, but given that survivors do care deeply about future safety of their communities, I think it's important to note that oftentimes perpetrators that participate in what are often called victim empathy circles or surrogate circles, where victims and offenders are not matched by offense, but they're still both impacted by the same kind of harm, is offender empathy goes up. And that's what we want. We want people in prison to be empathic. We want them to understand truly the impact of their actions. And quite frankly, a lot of the prisoners that I have met, when they're doing time, they're thinking about themselves as victims often. They're not really thinking about their own victims. And so this is one process, one of the only processes really, that brings them in direct contact with somebody who has experienced a deep trauma, like homicide, and gets to, they hear what this has been like for them. And so it can be a transformative process for everyone, should they choose it.
Yeah. I'm just mesmerized listening and, kind of imagining how that might all feel and come about. You mentioned that you might have some quotes from a few of those people who've gone through the restorative justice process.
Yeah, I just wanted to share. I just think, I mean, myself, I am not a survivor of homicide, so I want to be really careful that in this conversation, I'm bringing in some of the voices of survivors of homicide that I've worked with over the years. I wrapped up a research study in 2019 where the participants were victims of serious and violent crime, and I selected some data from that just to sort of share with folks about, don't take my word for it, but this is the voices of people who were affected directly by homicide that chose restorative justice, and this is what they said. And so when I asked them, what was the most important thing about the restorative justice process for you, they said, almost all of them said, to share my story and how the crime affected me personally. A lot of folks said that they wanted to participate in restorative justice to assist the offender in their rehabilitation, that they felt powerless, right? They felt quite powerless through the legal process. And this was one way that they felt like they could have influence or impact in the future, potentially. And so this is really common, right? When somebody goes through the court process and then the person's sentenced, the victim survivor is largely left out of that. And again, they can register as a victim, they can get updates on the offender and their progress, but that's on paper, right? So many survivors wanted the opportunity to face the offender and almost challenge them, like, to change their life. Like, no, you can't bring back my loved one, which is also, as an aside, why a lot of survivors of homicide don't love the term restorative justice. We can't restore a life, of course. But many survivors want the opportunity to help or to aid in the transformation of this perpetrator so that no more lives are lost. And sometimes survivors will say, my loved one has been taken from me, but this shouldn't mean that the perpetrator's life is also lost, that there has to be something good that comes out of this horrific tragedy. And so the care and concern and compassion that I have seen from survivors is really remarkable. And it doesn't come without very firm demands of accountability, right? To demand that the person responsible for their loved one's death is accountable and will be accountable for the rest of their life, right? Some of the other things survivors shared is I wanted to have a deeper understanding about the harm and the people involved. I wanted to have my questions answered and a safe place to talk. And I wanted to put this behind me and move forward somehow. Some survivors wanted to hear an apology. This is less common when we're talking about homicide. I think I'm sorry falls pretty hollow when we're talking about harm of this depth. But there are other ways that survivors asked for and saw accountability. So simply being able to speak of their loved one, many survivors bring pictures to show the offender. They want the offender to know truly what was lost. And when they can see the offender get that in a really deep, human, visceral way, something shifts for them.
Wow.
So I thought I would bring just one more quote here. It's a bit of a longer one from a woman who lost 2 family members to homicide, actually. And they said, "I thought the best thing about restorative justice was the sense of choice and control. It was an empowering process that gave me my power back. In the courtroom, you're just there and you're plunked into a witness stand and you feel powerless because you're at the mercy of the Crown prosecutor and the defense lawyer. I felt really small in that courtroom and everything felt out of balance. Restorative justice allowed me to have a voice, to tell the offender exactly how his actions impacted me, and I was able to humanize the situation and get rid of the monster I'd created in my own mind."
Wow. Wow, that's really, yeah, I'm going to say it again. Powerful. I don't know if your research dealt with this. Is there an average time frame that people experience if it's all successful, the restorative justice process? How many years from the crime or no?
Yeah, I think it really varies. I didn't look at that. I think everyone is on such a personal journey that some people I interviewed didn't even learn about restorative justice for years following, but they followed up with it and we're so glad they did. Others knew right away. They knew right away, I want to speak to them. I didn't know it was called restorative justice, but I knew that I wanted to have a conversation with this person and have them look me in the eye and hear from me what this was like for me and to be accountable to me. And so I would encourage the whoever's watching this, if you are interested in more personal stories, there are a couple of great books. One is Dead Reckoning by Karis Craig, whose father was killed. And she engaged in a restorative process with the stranger actually, who took his life. And the other is an older book called Walking After Midnight by Katie Hutchison. Her husband was murdered and she engaged in a restorative process with the young man responsible. And these are 2 beautiful memoirs that speak specifically to this topic.
Okay, yeah, we'll make sure and list those on our website, as well as the contact information where people could reach out if they had show any interest in learning more about restorative justice. So thank you very much. It's been really informative. Anything else before?
No, thank you very much for having me and your interest in this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alana. It's been great to have you. An honor with all of your hard work and dedication to the subject matter. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.